Sitting in the defendant's chair in courtroom 302 of the Cook County Circuit Court, Judge Harlan Voss wore a crisp suit and a confident, almost arrogant smirk. He thought he was untouchable, truly believing his robe gave him absolute power over everyone who stepped before him. But the quiet teenager he had chosen to humiliate was not just another kid from the wrong side of the tracks. It was Jalen Cain, a certified prodigy with a 160 IQ, who had memorized the Illinois compiled statutes. Sit tight and listen closely, because the karma in this real-life courtroom drama hits like a runaway freight train. The air inside Cook County Circuit Courtroom 302 tasted like stale coffee, cheap floor wax, and quiet desperation. Judge Harlan Voss was already in a foul mood. He was a man who worshipped his own authority. After time on the bench, he had developed a reputation for being ruthless, impatient, and wildly condescending to anyone who could not afford a high-priced attorney. He wore his black robe like a king's mantle, peering over his reading glasses with a perpetual scowl that made grown men stutter. To him, the people who cycled through his courtroom were just numbers on a page, nuisances interrupting his golf schedule. On this particular morning, case number 44B was called. Beaumont Property Management versus Lena Cain. Lena Cain walked up to the defendant's table, looking small and terrified. She was a hard-working single mother, a nurse's aide who worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Her hands trembled as she arranged a meager stack of utility bills and receipts on the heavy wooden table. She could not afford a lawyer. She was representing herself pro se, a term that usually made Judge Voss's eyes roll all the way into the back of his head. Sitting directly behind the wooden partition, leaning as close to his mother as the bailiff would allow, was Jalen Cain. Jalen was slight for his age, quiet, and completely unreadable. He wore a slightly oversized faded gray hoodie and kept a pair of thick taped glasses pushed up on the bridge of his nose. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, and relentlessly observant, missed absolutely nothing. On the other side of the aisle sat Barrett Langston, a notoriously slimy landlord who made his fortune buying up distressed properties and bullying low-income tenants out of their deposits. Langston was flanked by a slick, $400 an hour corporate attorney named Victor Kensington. Langston was suing Lena for $15,000 in fabricated property damages and seeking an immediate eviction notice, claiming she had violated half a dozen obscure clauses in her lease. It was a blatant shakedown, a predatory tactic Langston used to force out tenants so he could flip the apartments for double the rent. All right, let us get this over with. Judge Voss sighed heavily, not even bothering to look up from his papers. Mr. Kensington, your client is seeking immediate summary judgment and eviction. Ms. Cain, you have filed a handwritten response? Yes, Your Honor. Lena's voice shook. I do not owe him that money. The pipes burst because the building has not been maintained in years. I have the work orders right here. Save it, Ms. Cain, Voss snapped, cutting her off. This is not a town hall meeting. You signed a binding lease agreement. Section 4, paragraph B, clearly states the tenant assumes liability for internal water damage. Ignorance of the contract is not a defense. Lena looked devastated. She turned back to look at her son. Jalen did not look devastated. He looked deeply, intensely focused. He was furiously scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen flying across the paper. Every time Kensington spoke, Jalen wrote. Every time the judge cited a section, Jalen flipped a page in a thick, dog-eared binder he held in his lap. Judge Voss, catching the movement out of the corner of his eye, stopped talking. The courtroom went dead silent. Voss despised distractions, but more than anything, he despised a lack of deference. You there? The boy in the hoodie? Voss's voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Jalen stopped writing. He looked up, his expression completely blank. Are you related to the defendant? The judge demanded. He is my son, Your Honor, Lena said quickly, panic rising in her chest. "He is just here to support me. I am sorry if he—" I asked the boy. "Miss Cain." Voss interrupted harshly. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Tell me, young man, what exactly is so fascinating that you feel the need to scribble away in my courtroom? Are you writing a grocery list or maybe doing your algebra homework?" A few of the lawyers waiting in the gallery snickered. Barrett Langston smirked, whispering something to his attorney. Jalen stood up slowly. He did not slouch. He did not avert his eyes. He looked directly at the judge. "Neither, Your Honor," Jalen said. His voice was calm, remarkably steady for a teenager. "I am charting the procedural errors in Plaintiff's Exhibit C, as well as noting the blatant mischaracterization of Illinois property code you just allowed onto the record." The silence that followed was absolute. The bailiff stopped chewing his gum. Victor Kensington blinked, entirely taken aback. Lena grabbed her son's sleeve, whispering desperately for him to sit down. Judge Voss's face slowly turned the color of a bruised plum. He was used to terrorizing people. He was not used to being challenged, let alone by a teenager in a hoodie. "Is that right?" Voss said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, mocking whisper. He was furious, but his arrogance took the wheel. He decided right then and there to humiliate this kid so thoroughly that he would never speak out of turn again. A legal scholar. How wonderful. "Tell you what, son, since you are so well versed in the law, why do not we play a little game? Let us play truth or lie." Jalen tilted his head slightly. "I am not familiar with that procedural motion, Your Honor. It is simple." Voss sneered, stepping right into the trap of his own hubris. "I will give you a legal scenario regarding your mother's case. You tell me if it is the truth or a lie. If you get it right, I might just read your little handwritten notes. If you get it wrong, which you will, I hold you in contempt of court, throw you in a holding cell to learn some respect, and I grant Mr. Langston his eviction right here, right now. Do we have a deal?" Lena gasped. "Your Honor, please. He is just a boy. He is old enough to speak out of turn in my court. He is old enough to face the consequences." Voss snapped. He looked at Jalen, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Well, boy, you want to play lawyer? Truth or lie? What is it going to be?" Jalen gently pulled his sleeve from his mother's grasp. He looked at the judge, then at the smug landlord, Langston. "I accept your terms, Your Honor," Jalen said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Let us play." Judge Harlan Voss leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He loved putting people in their place. "All right, Mr. Cain," Voss began, dripping with condescension. "Let us start with a softball, truth or lie. Under Illinois state law, a landlord can legally execute an eviction and lock out a tenant without a court-ordered sheriff present, provided the tenant is more than 30 days delinquent on rent and the landlord has provided a written 5-day notice. Victor Kensington, the opposing lawyer, smiled knowingly. It was a trick question designed to confuse laymen who did not understand the difference between notice and execution. Jalen did not even blink. "Lie." Voss's eyebrows twitched. "Oh. Care to elaborate, counselor?" "A landlord cannot execute a self-help eviction under any circumstances in the state of Illinois." Jalen rattled off effortlessly, as if reciting the alphabet. "Pursuant to the Illinois Forcible Entry and Detainer Act 735, ILCS 5/9-101, a landlord must go through the judicial process and obtain an order of possession. Only the county sheriff can physically evict a tenant. Mr. Langston's threat to change my mother's locks tomorrow, as documented in Exhibit B of his filing, is not only a lie, it constitutes an illegal threat of constructive eviction, which opens him up to punitive damages." The smile vanished from Victor Kensington's face. Barrett Langston shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Voss sat up a little straighter. "Lucky guess. You have been reading up on eviction notices. Let us try something a little more complex. Truth or lie?" The implied warranty of habitability can be legally waived if the tenant signs a lease containing an explicit as-is clause, thereby releasing the landlord from liability for structural damages like, say, burst plumbing. Lie. Jalen shot back instantly, his tone flat and authoritative. The implied warranty of habitability is a matter of public policy in Illinois and cannot be waived by any lease provision, explicitly or implicitly. But what about commercial contracts? Voss countered, trying to muddy the waters. We are not in a commercial setting, Your Honor, Jalen replied, his eyes locked onto the judge. This is a residential lease. Furthermore, according to the precedent set in Jack Spring Incorporated versus Little, the Supreme Court of Illinois established that the implied warranty applies to all residential leases. Section 4, paragraph B of Mr. Langston's lease, the very section you cited to my mother minutes ago, is legally void and unenforceable. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The older attorneys sitting in the back rows were no longer looking at their phones. They were staring at the kid in the hoodie. Voss's face flushed deep red. The boy was not just guessing. He was citing Supreme Court precedent. The game was no longer amusing to the judge. It was becoming a threat to his authority. You have a good memory for trivia, boy, Voss growled, dropping the faux politeness. But knowing a few codes does not make you a lawyer. Let us talk about the financial damages. Truth or lie? Since your mother failed to properly notify maintenance in writing within 24 hours of the leak, as stipulated in the addendum, she assumes all liability for the water damage to the lower units. Jalen paused for a second. Voss smirked, thinking he had finally stumped the kid. That is a truth, Your Honor, Jalen said quietly. Voss slammed his hand on the desk. Uh-huh. Exactly. She failed to notify them in writing. Therefore, she owes the $15,000. Game over, son. You lose. I was not finished, Your Honor. Jalen's voice suddenly grew sharper, cutting through the judge's gloating like a razor. It is true, if the addendum is valid, but it is a lie in this courtroom. Excuse me? Voss spat. Truth or lie, Your Honor? Jalen said, stepping out from behind the wooden partition, standing tall in the center aisle. He was no longer just answering. He was taking control of the courtroom. A contract is considered fraudulent and wholly invalid if one party knowingly introduces forged documents into evidence to support their claim. Of course, that is the truth. Voss sneered. But what does that have to do with? I direct the court's attention to Plaintiff's Exhibit C. Jalen interrupted, pulling a sheet of paper from his binder and holding it up. This is the alleged addendum. Mr. Langston claims my mother signed, stipulating the 24-hour written notice. It is dated August 14th. Jalen walked over to the plaintiff's table. Victor Kensington tried to block him, but Jalen simply held the paper out toward the judge. My mother works double shifts at Memorial Hospital. I have her time cards right here, subpoenaed by myself through a pro se discovery request you authorized last month without reading. Jalen continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority. On that date, my mother was working a 36-hour mandated shift during a localized flu outbreak. She never left the hospital ward. She could not have signed this document in Mr. Langston's office. Jalen turned slowly, locking eyes with the landlord Barrett Langston, who had suddenly gone pale and sweaty. Furthermore, Jalen said, the trap finally springing shut. If you look at the notary stamp on this addendum, it belongs to Mr. David Corwin. I looked up Mr. Corwin's notary commission with the Illinois Secretary of State. His commission expired 3 years ago. Mr. Langston did not just forge my mother's signature, Your Honor. He submitted a fraudulently notarized document to this court in an attempt to extort $15,000 from a low-income tenant. The courtroom erupted. Several people gasped. A reporter sitting in the second row started typing frantically on his laptop. Victor Kensington shot out of his chair, his face white. Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. This boy is not a lawyer. No, I am not. Jalen said, turning back to Judge Voss, whose jaw had practically unhinged. But I have an eidetic memory, an IQ of 160, and I have spent time reading every legal text in the Chicago Public Library because I knew predators like your client would eventually try to take our home. Jalen walked back to his mother's side and looked up at the stunned judge. So, Judge Voss, Jalen said softly, the silence in the room hanging on his every word. Truth or lie? Did Mr. Langston just commit felony perjury and fraud upon the court? The heavy oak gavel slammed down with the force of a gunshot, but it did little to quell the immediate uproar in room 302. Judge Harlan Voss's face had shifted from a bruised plum to an alarming ashen gray. His courtroom, usually a well-oiled machine of intimidation and swift judgments, had just been hijacked by a teenager in a faded gray hoodie. Order. I said order in this court, Voss bellowed, his voice cracking slightly over the microphone. He glared at the gallery, where several independent attorneys were now openly whispering and pointing at the plaintiff's table. At that table, Barrett Langston looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. The smug, untouchable landlord was suddenly sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie suddenly looking like a noose. He tugged at his collar and looked frantically at his attorney. Victor Kensington, the $400 an hour corporate shark, was in full panic mode. He knew exactly what it meant to submit a forged document into evidence. It meant disbarment. It meant criminal charges. He shot out of his chair, knocking his heavy leather briefcase onto the floor, scattering pens and manila folders. Your Honor, I must strenuously object to this absolute circus. Kensington stammered, his slick composure entirely shattered. He pointed a trembling finger at Jalen. This boy is making wild, unsubstantiated accusations. My client manages thousands of units across Cook County. If there is a minor discrepancy with a notary stamp or a signature date, it is clearly a clerical error, an administrative oversight. To leap to accusations of felony fraud is. Administrative oversights do not forge a signature on a day the signatory is locked inside a hospital ward under a mandated quarantine, Mr. Kensington, Jalen interrupted, his voice cutting through the lawyer's frantic defense like a scalpel. He did not yell. He did not have to. The cold, hard facts were doing the heavy lifting, and administrative oversights certainly do not utilize a notary whose commission expired 36 months ago. That requires intent. That requires malice. Shut your mouth, boy, Judge Voss roared, pointing his gavel at Jalen. The judge was backed into a corner. A good judge, a fair judge, would have immediately impounded the documents, halted the eviction, and ordered an investigation. But Voss was not a fair judge. His ego was massive, and it had just been bruised in front of a gallery full of his peers by a kid he had explicitly chosen to mock. To admit Jalen was right was to admit that he, the great Judge Voss, had almost been an unwitting accomplice to a blatant crime because he could not be bothered to read a pro se litigant's defense. Survival instincts kicked in, and Voss chose the lowest possible road. He attacked the messenger. I have heard just about enough of this nonsense, Voss growled, leaning over the bench, his eyes narrowing into venomous slits. You think you are clever, Mr. Cain? You think memorizing a few statutes makes you. You are not a sworn officer of this court. You are not a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois. I never claimed to be, Your Honor, Jalen said, standing his ground. You are engaging in the unauthorized practice of law. Voss barked, practically spitting the words. You are interjecting yourself into a legal proceeding, conducting cross-examination, and submitting evidence without a license. That is a crime in itself. Lena Cain stood up, grabbing her son's arm, tears streaming down her face. Please, Judge Voss. He is just trying to protect our home. I submitted those papers. He just helped me organize them. Please sit down, Ms. Cain, or I will have you removed. Voss snapped. He turned his furious gaze back to Jalen. I am striking your so-called evidence from the record. Your mother failed to submit these time cards and notary records during the proper discovery window, and they are therefore inadmissible hearsay. Kensington, sensing a lifeline, immediately jumped on it. Exactly, Your Honor. The plaintiff moves to strike all statements made by the minor and requests immediate summary judgment in favor of Mr. Langston. Motion granted, Voss said swiftly, ignoring the shocked gasps from the back of the room. He looked at Jalen with a cruel, triumphant sneer. And as for you, young man, I warned you what would happen if you lost my little game of truth or lie. You tried to play lawyer, and you failed. Bailiff. The heavy-set bailiff, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, reluctantly stepped forward, resting a hand on his utility belt. Take this boy into custody, Voss ordered coldly. I am holding him in direct criminal contempt of court. He can spend time in juvenile detention. Maybe that will teach him to respect the sanctity of my courtroom. And Ms. Cain, your eviction is granted. You have time to vacate the premises. Lena screamed, burying her face in her hands. Barrett Langston let out a massive sigh of relief, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. The dirty trick had worked. The system was protecting its own. The bailiff reached out, grabbing Jalen by the shoulder. Come on, kid. Do not make this hard. Jalen did not fight the bailiff. He did not cry. He did not even look angry. He simply reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Before you place me in handcuffs, Your Honor, Jalen said, his voice eerily calm, resonating perfectly through the microphone on the defendant's table. You should know that you can strike my evidence from your record all you want, but you cannot strike it from the federal record. Voss froze, his gavel hovering in the air. What did you just say? Truth or lie, Judge Voss, Jalen said, his eyes locking onto the man on the bench. Did you really think a kid with a 160 IQ would walk into a rigged courtroom without an insurance policy? The silence that fell over room 302 was suffocating. The bailiff loosened his grip on Jalen's shoulder. Time ago, Jalen continued speaking clearly and deliberately. When Mr. Langston first filed his fabricated eviction notice, I did not just go to the library. I went through the public property records. I found a pattern. Every time Mr. Langston wanted to gentrify a building, he suddenly found water damage or lease violations with his lowest income tenants. Over 40 families evicted, all using the exact same as-is addendum, all notarized by the mysteriously expired Mr. David Corwin. Barrett Langston leaped to his feet. Lies. He is making this up. Sit down, Barrett, Kensington hissed, violently yanking his client back into his chair. The lawyer was looking at Jalen with genuine horror, realizing exactly what the boy had done. I compiled a 70-page dossier detailing the fraud, the forged signatures, and the financial extortion, Jalen stated. But I knew that if a black kid from the South Side walked into a police station with a binder, I would be laughed out of the lobby. And I knew, if we came to this court, a judge like you, who approves Langston's evictions without blinking, would try to silence us on a procedural technicality. Voss's jaw clenched. I am warning you, boy. So I did not go to the local police, Jalen said, taking a step away from the bailiff. I sent the dossier to the Illinois Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Bureau, and I sent a copy to the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. Voss scoffed, trying to regain his terrifying swagger. You are bluffing. You think the Attorney General cares about a leaky pipe in a rundown apartment? Bailiff, remove him. Actually, Harlan, we care quite a bit. The voice came from the very back row of the gallery. It was deep, authoritative, and completely unapologetic. Every head in the courtroom whipped around. A man stood up. He was wearing an immaculate tailored navy blue suit. He had thick silver hair and a briefcase resting on the bench in front of him. He stepped out into the center aisle and began walking calmly toward the front of the room. Judge Voss's eyes widened in sheer panic. He recognized the man immediately. Mr. Reed, Voss stammered, the color draining from his face all over again. Marcus Reed, the senior chief investigator for the Illinois Attorney General's office, stopped at the wooden partition right behind Jalen. He placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Lena Cain's shoulder, then looked up at the judge. Good morning, Judge Voss, Reed said, his voice polite, but laced with absolute steel. Fascinating morning session you are running here. I was wondering when you were going to notice me sitting back there. I did not realize the Attorney General's office was observing today. Voss managed to say, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them over his gavel. We were not observing you, Harlan, Reed said, gesturing down to Jalen. We were observing Mr. Cain's operation. When this young man sent us his dossier, my entire fraud department spent time verifying his math. It was flawless. But as Mr. Cain brilliantly pointed out in his emails to us, we needed Mr. Langston to commit to the fraud on the record under oath to guarantee a felony indictment. Reed turned his gaze to Barrett Langston and Victor Kensington. Langston looked like he was about to vomit. Kensington was staring at the floor, already calculating plea deals in his head. We needed Mr. Langston to officially submit that forged addendum to a judge, Reed continued. So Jalen acted as the bait. He intentionally kept his defense brief and handwritten, knowing Mr. Langston's arrogance would lead him to present the fraudulent documents today to force a quick summary judgment. Reed looked back at Judge Voss, and the polite smile vanished. What we did not anticipate, Reed said, his voice turning dangerously cold, was a sitting Cook County Circuit Court judge flagrantly ignoring obvious perjury, actively threatening a minor, and attempting to throw out exculpatory evidence just to protect his own bruised ego. Voss swallowed hard. Marcus, now listen, you know how these pro se cases are. The boy was being disruptive. I was simply trying to maintain order and adhere to the rules of civil procedure. Save it for the Judicial Conduct Board, Harlan. Reed interrupted sharply. I have the entire transcript of your little truth or lie game being recorded by the court reporter right there. You tried to jail a whistleblower to protect a slumlord. That does not play well in the papers. Reed unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a stack of manila envelopes, dropping them onto the plaintiff's table, right in front of the terrified landlord. Barrett Langston, Reed announced, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. You are officially under investigation by the Attorney General's office for multiple counts of felony perjury, real estate fraud, and extortion. There are 2 state troopers waiting in the hallway outside these doors. I suggest you and Mr. Kensington go have a chat with them now. Langston stood up on shaking legs. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the judge. With Kensington trailing behind him like a beaten dog, the landlord walked down the center aisle and out the double doors, where the heavy, distinct sound of handcuffs clicking shut immediately echoed into the courtroom. Reed turned to Jalen. The seasoned federal investigator looked at the teenager in the hoodie with genuine, unfiltered respect. You did good, kid, Reed said softly. You got him. Jalen pushed his taped glasses up the bridge of his nose. For the first time all morning, a tiny, subtle smile broke across his face. Truth or lie, Mr. Reed? Jalen asked. Reed chuckled. Truth. Absolute truth. Judge Harlan Voss sat slouched in his high-back leather chair, looking entirely defeated. His courtroom, his kingdom, had just been completely dismantled. He looked down at Jalen Cain, who was hugging Jalen so tightly she was practically lifting him off the ground, crying tears of sheer relief. The game was over. The predator had lunged, but the prey had brought a bigger set of teeth. The gavel never actually struck the sound block to dismiss the session. Judge Harlan Voss's hand was shaking too badly. He simply let the wooden mallet slip from his fingers, clattering onto the mahogany desk. Room 302, normally a chamber where the poor and unrepresented were systematically ground into dust, had transformed into the site of a spectacular execution. Court is adjourned? Voss mumbled, his voice devoid of its usual booming arrogance. He did not wait for the bailiff to announce his departure. He stood up, his black robe suddenly looking 3 sizes too big, and practically fled into his private chambers, shutting the heavy oak door behind him with a pathetic click. Down in the aisle, Marcus Reed, the senior chief investigator, was shaking Jalen's hand. Jalen Cain was still crying, but the tears of terror had turned into tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She pulled Reed into a desperate hug, thanking him over and over again. "Do not thank me, Ms. Cain," Reed said gently, stepping back and gesturing to the teenager beside her. "I have been hunting Barrett Langston for time. We knew he was dirty, but he hid his paper trails behind a maze of LLCs and shell corporations. It took a kid with a library card and a 160 IQ to finally crack the foundation. Your son is a terrifying young man, and I mean that as the highest compliment." As they walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy double doors, the reality of the morning began to spill into the public sphere. David Garrison, the seasoned court reporter for the Chicago Daily Observer, who had been sitting in the second row, did not even wait to get back to his desk. He was typing the article on his phone as he jogged down the courthouse steps. By that afternoon, the story broke. The headline was absolute dynamite. Truth or lie? Southside prodigy outsmarts slumlord, exposes fraud, and silences arrogant judge in open court. Garrison had requested the expedited transcript from the court stenographer. He published verbatim quotes of Judge Voss's mocking truth or lie game. He detailed exactly how Jalen had systematically dismantled the illegal eviction notice, cited Supreme Court precedent from memory, and dropped the bombshell of the expired notary stamp. The internet did what the internet does best. It poured gasoline on the fire. Within hours, the story went viral. The official court audio recording was leaked, and millions of people listened to Voss's smug, dripping condescension morph into stuttering panic. They heard the cold, undeniable brilliance in Jalen's calm voice as he trapped the judge in his own twisted game. The karma hit Judge Harlan Voss with the force of a wrecking ball. For time, he had treated his courtroom like a personal fiefdom, humiliating the vulnerable for his own amusement. Now, he was the one being publicly humiliated on a national scale. The Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board convened an emergency session. They did not just look at the Cain case. The intense media scrutiny forced them to audit Voss's entire judicial record. They found dozens of instances where he had bypassed procedural fairness to side with corporate landlords against unrepresented tenants. Voss was suspended without pay, pending a full ethics investigation. Facing an inevitable and highly publicized disbarment, Harlan Voss chose the coward's way out. He submitted his resignation. There was no retirement party. There were no fond farewells from his colleagues. His golf buddies at the elite country club suddenly stopped returning his calls. He became a pariah, a cautionary tale of judicial hubris, forced to sit in his empty suburban mansion and watch his legacy turn to ash on the evening news. Meanwhile, Barrett Langston's empire was crumbling to dust. The two state troopers in the hallway had escorted Langston and his attorney, Victor Kensington, directly to the precinct. When the Attorney General's office executed search warrants on Langston Property Management's headquarters, they found exactly what Jalen's 70-page dossier had predicted. They uncovered a systematic operation of fabricating repair invoices, forging tenant signatures on predatory addendums, and intentionally neglecting building maintenance to force out low-income families. Langston's assets were immediately frozen. A federal judge placed his entire portfolio of properties into receivership. For the first time in his life, the arrogant millionaire was sitting in a concrete cell at Cook County Jail, entirely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his slick suits, waiting to face counts of felony fraud. But the story was not quite over because the corporate shark, Victor Kensington, was desperately trying to swim away from the sinking ship. The atmosphere in this Cain apartment was entirely different. The chronic drip from the ceiling had been repaired by the state-appointed receivership management company. The threat of eviction was gone. Jalen was sitting at the small kitchen table, calmly working his way through a massive leather-bound textbook on constitutional law when his mother brought him a cup of tea. She looked lighter, years younger than she had on the day of the trial. "You got another letter from university today," Lena said, smiling as she set a thick envelope on the table. "I think this one is from Georgetown." Jalen barely glanced at it. "Put it in the box with the others, Mom. I have not finished my junior year of high school yet." Ever since the story broke, Jalen had become a national sensation. Talk shows had called. Elite prep schools offered full-ride scholarships. But Jalen was not interested in the spotlight. He had seen the ugly mechanical heart of the justice system, and he was completely focused on learning how to dismantle it. His phone buzzed. It was Marcus Reed from the Attorney General's office. "Morning, Jalen." Reed's gruff voice crackled through the speaker. "I thought you want to know. Victor Kensington just offered us a proffer. He is trying to cut a plea deal. He is claiming ignorance. He is going to say Langston handed him the forged documents, and he had no idea they were fake." "Exactly," Reed sighed. "He is trying to invoke attorney-client privilege on the communications and throwing Langston entirely under the bus. Without direct proof that Kensington actively participated in the forgery, the state bar might only hit him with a slap on the wrist for negligence. He might keep his license." Jalen sat perfectly still for a moment, his mind working like a supercomputer, processing the variables. He remembered the documents. He remembered the exact layout of the forged addendum that had almost cost his mother her home. "Mr. Reed," Jalen said slowly, "do you still have the original digital PDF files of the fake addendums that Langston's office submitted in their electronic discovery packet?" "Yes, they are in our secure server." "Why?" "When I was building the dossier, I could not access the raw digital files, only the printed copies filed with the clerk." Jalen explained, his voice taking on that same laser-focused edge it had in the courtroom. "But if you look at the metadata, the hidden file properties of those PDFs, you can see the authoring history. Mr. Kensington is a partner at a massive corporate firm. They use proprietary document management software. It leaves a digital watermark on the creation source." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jalen could hear Reed furiously typing on his keyboard. "Check the original creation tag on the document properties," Jalen instructed. "Not the modified date, the creation date." A few seconds later, Reed let out a low whistle. "Well, I will be damned. The author tag does not belong to Langston Property Management. It belongs to the network domain of Victor Kensington's law firm. It was generated on his personal terminal." "Kensington did not just submit the forged documents," Jalen said coldly. "He drafted them. He knew the notary was expired. He built the weapon for Langston to use." "Jalen," Reed said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and absolute ruthlessness, "you just nailed the coffin shut. We are indicting Kensington for conspiracy to commit fraud. He is going to be disbarred, and he will be sharing a cell block with his client." When Jalen hung up the phone, a deep sense of satisfaction finally settled over him. The karma was complete. The men who had tried to destroy his family, the men who believed their money and their degrees made them untouchable, were utterly ruined by their own hubris. A black town car pulled up outside the Cain apartment building. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He walked up to the third floor and knocked on the door. Lena opened it, looking surprised. "Can I help you?" "Good afternoon, Ms. Cain," the man said warmly, handing her a pristine business card. "My name is Nolan Hargrove. I am the managing partner at Hargrove, Crawford and Associates in downtown Chicago. I was wondering if I might have a word with your son." Hargrove was a legend in the Chicago legal scene. He ran one of the most powerful civil rights and defense firms in the Midwest, a firm known for taking on massive corporate corruption cases and winning. Lena let him in. Jalen was sitting at the kitchen table, looking up from his notes. "Jalen," Hargrove said, taking a seat opposite the teenager. He did not speak to Jalen like a child. He looked at him as an equal. "I read the transcript of what you did to Harlan Voss. I also just got off the phone with Marcus Reed, who told me how you just dismantled Victor Kensington's plea deal using PDF metadata. It was a logical oversight on Mr. Kensington's part," Jalen said evenly. "He relied on his secretary to scrub the files, and she failed." Hargrove laughed, a rich, booming sound. "You are a terrifying kid, Jalen, and I need terrifying people at my firm. People who see the angles no one else sees." "I do not have a law degree, Mr. Hargrove." "I am. I know." Hargrove smiled. "But you will. Here is my offer. My firm will establish a full trust to cover the remainder of your private preparatory education as well as your undergraduate and law school tuition at any institution you choose in the country. In exchange, when you pass the bar, you come work for me." Lena gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. It was a golden ticket. It was millions of dollars in education and a guaranteed future at a top-tier firm. Jalen looked at the contract Hargrove slid across the table. He read the clauses quickly, his eyes scanning the legalese. Then, he looked up at the powerhouse attorney. "It is a generous offer, Mr. Hargrove," Jalen said quietly. "But I have a counter-proposal." Hargrove raised an eyebrow, thoroughly amused. "You are negotiating with me? All right, let us hear it." "The tuition is acceptable," Jalen said. "But I also want a paid part-time position at your firm, starting as a junior legal researcher. I want access to your Westlaw accounts and your firm's archives, and I want a signing bonus structured as an independent living stipend for my mother, sufficient to replace her current income so she can quit working double shifts at the hospital." Hargrove stared at the teenager. There was no arrogance in Jalen's eyes, only a fierce, unyielding protective instinct for the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Hargrove did not hesitate. He pulled a Montblanc pen from his breast pocket, clicked it, and handed it to Jalen. "We will draft the amendments tomorrow," Hargrove said, grinning broadly. "Welcome to the firm, Mr. Cain." The bitter, biting wind of the Chicago winter was whipping off Lake Michigan. But inside the gleaming glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Hargrove, Crawford & Associates, it was comfortably warm. The room smelled of expensive espresso and polished mahogany, a far cry from the stale, desperate air of Cook County Circuit Courtroom 302. Jalen Cain sat at the head of a massive granite table. He was no longer wearing the oversized, faded gray hoodie. Instead, he wore a sharp-tailored navy blazer, a crisp white button-down shirt, and his signature taped glasses. He was the youngest employee in the history of the firm, but nobody treated him like a kid. The senior partners had quickly learned that when Jalen spoke, you stopped talking and took notes. The fallout from that fateful morning had permanently altered the landscape of the city's legal and real estate sectors. Barrett Langston, the untouchable slumlord, was no longer wearing custom silk suits. After the Attorney General's office raided his shell corporations, the full scope of his criminal enterprise was laid bare. He pleaded guilty to counts of felony fraud, extortion, and forgery. A federal judge sentenced him to years in the Stateville Correctional Center. His entire real estate portfolio was liquidated by the state to provide restitution to the hundreds of families he had illegally evicted. His slick, $400 an hour attorney, Victor Kensington, fared no better. Thanks to Jalen's brilliant catch regarding the PDF metadata, Kensington could not hide behind attorney-client privilege. The State Bar Association publicly stripped him of his license, and he was handed a sentence for conspiracy to commit fraud. The corporate shark was now just another inmate trading legal advice for commissary snacks. But the most spectacular downfall belonged to Judge Harlan Voss. Voss had believed that by resigning from the bench, he could quietly fade into the background, keeping his lucrative pension and his sprawling suburban estate. He thought he had outsmarted the system one last time. He was dead wrong. Nolan Hargrove walked into the glass-walled conference room carrying a thick, red-tabbed accordion file. He dropped it onto the granite table right in front of Jalen. "Good morning, Jalen," Hargrove said, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "I have a new project for you, and I think you are going to enjoy this one immensely." Jalen opened the file. The first page was a draft for a massive civil lawsuit. The lead plaintiff was Jalen Cain, followed by the names of 43 other low-income tenants. The primary defendant listed was Harlan Voss. Voss avoided criminal charges because the Judicial Conduct Board could not definitively prove he was taking direct bribes from Langston. Hargrove explained, pacing the length of the room. They proved he was biased, cruel, and negligent. But without a paper trail of cash, the local prosecutors would not touch him for corruption. He is sitting in his mansion right now, thinking he got away with his wealth intact. Jalen began flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the financial disclosures Hargrove had managed to subpoena. You want to file a civil class action suit for damages against a former judge? Judicial immunity usually protects them from civil liability for actions taken on the bench. Usually, yes, Hargrove said, his eyes gleaming. Unless we can prove that his actions were not just terrible judicial rulings, but part of a coordinated off-the-books conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights under color of law. If we pierce that immunity, we can go after his personal assets, his estate, his pension, everything. But to do that, we need to find the missing link. We need to prove Voss and Langston were financially connected. Hargrove leaned over the table, tapping the file. I need you to find the ghost in the machine, Jalen. I need you to find the money. Jalen did not say a word. He pulled the massive stack of financial records toward him, uncapped a red pen, and went to work. For time, Jalen practically lived in the firm's archives. He cross-referenced decades of Voss's obscure stock trades, real estate investments, and country club memberships with a labyrinth of Barrett Langston's liquidated LLCs. It was a needle in a stack of needles buried under miles of financial red tape designed to confuse forensic accountants. But Jalen's eidetic memory and 160 IQ were built for this exact puzzle. He did not just see numbers, he saw patterns, frequencies, and anomalies. The pieces finally clicked into place. Jalen was staring at a charitable foundation ledger belonging to an elite private golf club in the suburbs, the exact club where Voss spent his weekends. He compared it against a list of anonymous corporate donations made by a holding company registered in Delaware. Jalen picked up his phone and dialed Hargrove. The senior partner answered on the first ring. I found it, Jalen said, his voice calm and icy. Tell me, Hargrove demanded. Langston did not hand Voss envelopes of cash. Jalen explained, looking at his meticulously drawn diagram. He paid Voss's exorbitant country club dues, his property taxes, and funded his private retirement account through a proxy charity set up under the Delaware Holding Company. Every time Voss granted a summary eviction for one of Langston's buildings, exactly 4 days later, an anonymous donation matching the exact value of the property's projected rent increase was deposited into the proxy charity. Silence hung on the line. Then, Hargrove let out a harsh, victorious laugh. It is a kickback scheme, laundering bribes through a 501c3. It completely voids his judicial immunity. Jalen, you did not just find a civil case. You just handed the FBI a federal racketeering indictment on a silver platter. Let us draft the summons, Jalen said softly. Harlan Voss was sitting on the patio of his sprawling estate, sipping a scotch, when a black town car pulled into his long driveway. A process server stepped out, walked past the security gates, and handed the disgraced judge a thick manila envelope. Voss tore it open. As he read the civil summons and the attached exhibit, a flawless, undeniable financial trace linking his secret accounts to Barrett Langston's criminal enterprise, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. His scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the stone patio. At the very bottom of the summons, printed in bold, undeniable ink, was the name of the lead paralegal who had drafted the destruction of his life. Prepared by Jalen Cain. The kid he had mocked, the kid he had tried to throw in a holding cell, the kid he had challenged to a game of truth or lie. The predator had finally, undeniably become the prey. Voss's assets were frozen. He was forced to sell his mansion at a massive loss just to afford defense attorneys for the impending federal indictment. He was left with absolutely nothing. A broken man who had learned the hardest possible way that arrogance is a fragile shield against true, quiet brilliance. Far away from the shattered ruins of Voss's life, Lena Cain sat in the sunlit living room of a beautiful, secure townhome in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. She was not wearing nursing scrubs. She was wearing comfortable clothes, sipping tea, and reading a textbook for the advanced nursing degree the firm's trust was paying for. She did not have to work double shifts anymore. She did not have to fear a knock on the door or leaky ceiling. She was safe. Jalen stood by the large bay window of their new home, looking out over the city skyline. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an email from Harvard Law School, expressing intense interest in his early admission application for the following year. He smiled, sliding the phone back into his pocket. He had once stepped into a rigged courtroom with nothing but a gray hoodie and a brilliant mind, hoping to save his mother. He had ended up tearing down a corrupt empire. The gavel had dropped, but Jalen Cain was the one who finally delivered the verdict. Arrogance is a dangerous blunder. Judge Harlan Voss and Barrett Langston thought they held all the cards because they had the money, the titles, and the power. They looked at a quiet teenager from the South Side and saw nothing but an easy target. But true genius does not need to shout to be heard. And the truth does not care about the size of your bank account. Jalen Cain proved that when you weaponize knowledge, integrity, and relentless preparation, you can dismantle the most corrupt systems from the inside out. Karma did not just knock on the door of those greedy men. It kicked the door off its hinges and handed them the bill.